This is the WGBH Forum Network.
The reason we wanted to do this is because Quil, who has been with us for 8 years now, Quil is based in Jerusalem now. He was based in Washington before that. Before that, he'd been in Iraq 6, 7 times?
14.
14 times in Iraq. Quil has more stories to tell than can possibly be included in this book. But Quil is on a book tour right now, and the book Invisible Nation, he's going to be talking about that. Quil just came back from Tehran, and we're really glad to have him on our staff and glad to have him here. Come join us.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks. I would just sit down at the table, but I actually have a bit of a sore throat, so I'm going to take advantage of this high-tech microphone machine. Okay, so I'll give a short spiel about my book and about travels in Iraqi Kurdistan, and then we can talk questions about reporting on Iraq and Kurdistan, or questions about the book, or questions about getting the book together, or really we could talk about anything. My first trip to Iraqi Kurdistan was in the spring of 2000. I was on a fellowship that took me there. It was my second trip to Iraq, and I managed to get permission to go north, and I was driving north in a beat-up orange and white taxi cab accompanied by 2 low-level Ba'athist spies who were my driver and my translator. As we moved north from the city of Kirkuk and entered the Kurdish safe zone, this ridge, and this is the tippy top of the ridge that I have up there, this ridge sort of rose up in view, and for a minute I thought that the Kurds had somehow gotten 1,000 bulldozers and just made a big wall of earth just to make a line across the geography and say, down there that's Arab Iraq, and up here it's different. And it is. It's green as any place I've ever been, especially in the springtime when I was first visiting. And there's a frosting of flowers, different every couple of days, red and white and blue. It really is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been in the springtime, and looks nothing like the desert and the wasteland that is much of central and southern Iraq. As we rolled up to the last Iraqi government, this is Saddam's time, checkpoint, and we rolled through, and we came up to the first Kurdish informal militiaman checkpoint. My driver and translator, the 2 Ba'athist spies, got a little bit nervous, understandably, and indeed we were promptly arrested and taken to jail, but it was all in good fun. I knew that the Kurds didn't really have anything against foreign journalists. Quite the contrary, they were dying to get their story out to the world, that they had been living since 1991 in the semi-autonomous zone in the north of Iraq, safe from Saddam. Kurdistan in Iraq is really everything that the United States, that the Bush administration promised would happen when they invaded Iraq. The Kurdish region now has had no single U.S. soldier killed since the invasion. It's safe. It's pro-democratic. It's not a perfect democracy yet, but it's headed in that direction. It's Muslim, but moderate for the most part. Incredibly pro-American. It doesn't even have any particular problem with Israel. And at the moment, I would say one of the biggest problems in the north really is urban sprawl. They're building it as fast as they can. We're talking about these 3 provinces here, which are the Kurdish provinces in the north. The question really is why the United States, with not much other good news to report, isn't talking louder about this success in the north. And the answer is that they're afraid it might be too successful, and that if the Kurds could somehow get an independent state, which is what they've always wanted, it would upset every country in the region, unlike anything since the Israelis declared independence in 1948. The Kurds know this, and so far they're willing to, as much as they want to promote themselves for investment and for their safety, for what they've achieved in terms of elections, they also know that they need to keep quiet and keep this sort of virtual statehood where they can rule themselves with their own laws, not really have to pay too much attention to Baghdad, and have a state in everything but name. Kurds know Americans a lot better than we know them. The first Kurdish rebel against the Iraqi state, his name was Sheikh Mahmoud Barzinji. He's often pictured with a big flowing robe and a huge walrus mustache and a ceremonial dagger. And he's said to have carried on his arm pages from the Quran, and like a talisman, he also had Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. He thought that this new era, 1919, of self-determination and freedom was going to free his people and give them their own state. He was wrong, and started a trend, an unfortunate habit on the part of the Kurds, Kurdish rebels, of relying on the United States and thinking that the United States would be there to save them. I'll just zoom in on this a little bit. All over northern Iraq, especially on one side of it, you'll see pictures of this gentleman whose name is Mullah Mustafa Barzani. He was probably the greatest Kurdish rebel and one of the greatest rebels of the 20th century, up there with Che Guevara and Ahmed Shah Massoud. He had been fighting wars against the state all his life. He was weaned in prison, in a Turkish prison. You can't make this stuff up. And in 1975, he was fighting hard against Saddam, really at the behest of the Shah and with help from America. In 2003, I was in northern Iraq, and before the war, I spent about 3 months there waiting for the war to start. And I did a little schoolyard poll. It actually aired on a show back then. I was just talking with kids in probably 14, 15-year-olds, asking them, I was trying to make trouble. I was saying, are you Kurdish or are you Iraqi? And they would all say, we're Kurdish, we're Kurdish. But they very quickly told me, first off, that they'll never forgive Great Britain for destroying their chance of having a country with the Treaty of Severus in 1919, which was later superseded by the Treaty of Lausanne. These are 14-year-olds. And then the next word that comes out of their mouths is Henry Kissinger. And I'm thinking, how many junior high schoolers in the United States could tell me who Henry Kissinger is? But the Kurds know him, and they're not happy. Mullah Mustafa Barzani, the great Kurdish rebel, had been in that neighborhood for a long time, and he knew he couldn't trust the Shah of Iran. He knew he couldn't trust any of the regional powers, but he kept saying that the United States is too great a power to betray the Kurds. But in March of 1975, the Shah of Iran secretly settled his disputes with Saddam Hussein. And he didn't need the Kurds to be making trouble for Saddam anymore, and he cut off the aid overnight. The Kurds blame Henry Kissinger for this because all the while this was going on, and Kissinger knew several days before that the aid was going to stop, that the deal had been cut. And all the while they were asking Barzani was asking Kissinger and saying, listen, I don't want to get slaughtered. I'm only going to do this if I've got you at my back. And Kissinger's just said, we love you. Kept on sending him letters like that. And when the dime was dropped and the Shah stopped supplying arms for the Kurds, they were at Saddam's mercy, and they were slaughtered in the thousands. Mullah Mustafa fled eventually to America, where he died in exile. But the Kurds would say that there have been many more betrayals like this. In the 1980s, when Saddam Hussein decided that the problem wasn't Kurdish rebels so much as just the existence of Kurds, and he started a campaign which most people consider genocidal. He killed at least 180,000 Kurds. I just want to show you a picture of the countryside here. You'll notice that the trees are much of a similar height, and I've never seen erosion like this anywhere with the exception of Haiti, where the forests are just gone and you're down to sort of the teeth and the bones of the earth. Kurdistan was devastated. Saddam razed tens of thousands of villages to the ground and eliminated forests completely to deny the rebels anywhere to move. This culminated in 1988 with the gassing to death of about 10,000 people in the town of Halabja. This is just a shot I took in Halabja a few years later when they were digging to create a memorial. And throughout this, the United States at that time was giving assistance to Iraq in the Iran-Iraq War, and we later learned was also covertly arming Iran. And no one really heard the Kurds crying for help. They were angry at America about not helping. They were also angry at their Arab Sunni neighbors who share the same religion and the same sect as them, but none of whom raised a fuss against Saddam. There were more betrayals, but in 1991, with the Gulf War, began what I call the accidental creation of Kurdistan. And it was engendered by two accidents made by two American presidents named Bush. President Bush Sr. in 1991 wanted to have a very neat war, and he had one. He kicked Saddam out of Kuwait. And the realists in his administration, Brent Scowcroft and others, had no interest in going to Baghdad. They thought it would be messy. They thought it would look a lot like what it looks like now. They thought it would probably help Iran and be a terrible mess. But George Bush Sr. himself went off script a couple of times, and he said something to the effect of, there's another way for this to end. The Iraqi people can rise up against the dictator. What he meant was that somebody should put a bullet in Saddam's head, and we could have a nice Sunni general just like Saddam but with a different name to rule Iraq. But what the Kurds and the Shiites heard was a clear call for them to rebel, and that America would be at their backs. Well, they did, but America let them down. It took them a few days to realize that there were no American troops or helicopters coming to help them. And again, Saddam, much to his disbelief, still in power, started to consolidate. And he killed, again, tens of thousands of Shiites in the south and the Kurds in the north. The Kurds had seen Saddam's wrath before, and about 1.5 million of a population of around 4 million decided that anywhere but here was the right place to be. And they started fleeing across the mountains to Iran and to Turkey. This is a picture I got from General Zinni, who was part of the American force there at the time. And as you can see, some of these Kurds are barefoot, walking across the mountains. It was a late winter that year. And the Kurds, I've talked to people who said they saw patients from the hospital walking out of the wards holding their own IV bags, walking barefoot out of the country, children in scoops of bulldozers and construction equipment, driving out any way they could. This refugee crisis, particularly with Turkey, didn't first help the Kurds. President Bush Sr. went fishing, and then Prime Minister John Major infamously replied to a question that he didn't recall asking these particular people to launch this particular insurrection. But media pressure and photos like this one, and pictures of refugees fleeing as far as the eye can see across the mountains to Turkey, actually shamed the governments of Britain, America, and France, and several others into doing something about it. And I should say as an aside that I was in 1991, I was in college, and this is one of the reasons I became a journalist. I think it's one of the clearest examples of the press moving world events. What ensued was the first humanitarian intervention in history, the first time the United Nations authorized humanitarian help against the sovereign will of a government. And America reinvaded northern Iraq and created a tiny Kurdish safe haven, which then became very quickly expanded into what's now the Kurdish zone. From 1991, I'll just flip through a few pictures here I have. That's Jim Muir in the center, who's our BBC correspondent, who furnished me some of these pictures. To his right is Jalal Talabani, one of the Kurdish leaders, and Masoud Barzani, who's the son of the great rebel leader Mullah Mustafa Barzani we saw before. This was in 1991 when they were consolidating this safe zone that America would then protect for the next dozen years. And here's one last photo of that. The slideshow I haven't done before with the presentation, so it's a little choppy, but this is General J. Garner, who you'll remember was in charge of the post-war originally in charge of the post-war in 2003. This is him in 1991 after they've created this safe zone, and he's making a deal with Talabani and Barzani about how the U.S. is going to withdraw. It's generally considered one of the best, one of the most successful humanitarian operations ever carried out, with the U.S. Army working with a lot of NGOs. And then I would argue what happened over the next 12 years was by accident, one of the most successful nation-building projects the United States has launched in recent history, in the 20th century. The Kurds were out of sight. They were being patrolled and protected by outside neighbors, protected from Saddam and from Turkey and from Iran by American and British and for a while French airplanes. And it was pretty ugly for a while. You saw a lot of the score settling and a lot of the mess that you see now in the rest of Iraq. By the end of the 1990s, they were getting over this. They'd had a brief and stupid civil war. And they were settling in and waiting, essentially, for the second President Bush to come along to, again, accidentally liberate the Kurds. President Bush, George W. Bush, also never had any intention of creating a Kurdish homeland or particularly helping the Kurds. As you'll recall, he was intent on bringing a large part of his army through Turkey, and in order to do that was willing to let 60,000 Turkish troops come through with him. When I went back to Iraq in 2003, and I lucked into a visa to Iran and then snuck across the mountains to the north, and the Kurds that I met there told me that they weren't so worried about Saddam, although they were afraid that he had some chemical weapons that he might use as a last gasp at them. They were afraid about the Turks coming in. Turkey has its own huge Kurdish population and is afraid that an independent Kurdistan in Iraq would inspire their Kurds to shoot for the same thing. And the Kurds there told me that if the Turkish troops come in here, there'll be a guerrilla war, no question. It would have been a horrible disaster for America, I think, and it would have created a whole nother front in the war. But luckily maybe for everyone, what you could almost call the battle for Kurdish independence was fought in the Turkish parliament in March 31st of 2003, when the Turks voted not to let America bring any troops through. The Americans were horribly upset, and the Kurds were celebrating. Because not only did this mean that there weren't going to be any Turkish troops coming through to break the China, but it put Turkish-American relations in the doghouse for years. And whereas Turkey's interests have always outweighed the interest of this small group of Kurds in northern Iraq, suddenly that equation was shifted. For a few years, and I would say it's still sorting itself out, because America was so offended that the Turks wouldn't help them. What it also meant is that America now had no one to turn to in the north, except for the Kurdish militias, about 60,000 men-at-arms, who were standing there just dying to work with the Americans. And I recall standing on somebody's giving me rabbit ears there. Anyway, standing on a ridge in northern Iraq, in Kurdistan in 2003 and this is that actually the same day that the Kurdish irregulars, along with a small group of American special forces, were attacking a small Islamist group called Ansar al-Islam that had been hiding out in the mountains there. And I was talking with a U.S. Special Forces soldier, and I could see that there was a chemistry forming between these two groups, between the Kurdish fighters and the U.S. Special Forces. The Kurds were incredibly impressed with the Americans. First off, that they could take a little laptop computer and a satellite dish and call in airstrikes that would make the mountaintop at the other end of the valley disappear. They were also fascinated with this incredibly technically advanced thing called the meal ready to eat. It's a brown plastic bag. You can open it up and it has a little chemical thing you add water to, and it heats up this sort of mush of noodles and meat, and they thought there was nothing better for a guerrilla fighter than one of these. The Americans were also impressed with the Kurds. I was talking with this soldier as we looked across the valley and the battle was going on, and he said, yeah, we saw the first Kurdish fighter come back from the battle this morning, and we were kind of making fun of him from a distance. He was just limping, and we thought maybe he'd twisted his ankle and he'd gone running home. When he got closer, we found out he'd been shot through the chest. And he said, these are some tough people here. Kurds don't have medics or medevac. They just have to walk to the back, even if it's a couple of miles, if they need medical attention. And the soldier, this American guy, who's actually from my home state of Maine, was looking around at and I don't have that many great landscape pictures here, but you can see the snowy capped mountains in the background, and it's just gorgeous and green. And he said, look out there, couldn't you be in Ireland or something like that? I said, I had no idea. If I lived here, I'd want to own it too. And I could tell at that point that the Americans were definitely drinking some of the Kurdish Kool-Aid. Things looked great from that point for the Kurds. There was what they would have said as a dream team put in charge of the American occupation. It was Jay Garner, who they remembered from 1991, who they considered a national hero, and Zalmay Khalilzad, who you can see here. He's about to kiss the Iraqi foreign minister, and here's Masoud Barzani in the foreground. These were old friends. Jay Garner, as I said, was a national hero in Kurdistan. Zalmay Khalilzad, when the Kurds were knocking on doors in Washington in 1990, 1991, and when they were having those doors slammed in their faces, there was one young undersecretary at the Pentagon, an Afghan American named Zalmay Khalilzad, who opened the door to them. He was the only one in the U.S. government who saw them. And a dozen years later, this was looking to have played wonderfully in their favor. He was friends with all the Kurdish leadership. But as you know, both Garner and Khalilzad were unceremoniously sacked and replaced by Paul Bremer, who the Kurds knew about as little about Bremer as he knew about them. The only thing they knew about Bremer was that it always says that he worked for Henry Kissinger. So if you're going to Kurdistan, take that off your resume. It's not a good reference. It soon turned out that Bremer knew even less about them than he knew even less about the Kurds than they knew about him. On his first trip north, he was fascinated by all of these portraits everywhere of Mullah Mustafa Barzani. And as you can tell, his son Masoud, who's the president of the Kurdistan region, looks an awful lot like him. But Bremer, in a very nonchalant, informal American sort of way, when he'd been up there for a couple of hours, sort of went up to Masoud and said, "Hey, who's the guy in the suit?" Everybody knew who it was except Bremer, because I don't know if he hadn't taken the time to read maybe a magazine article about Iraq before he got there. Even his staff were just slack-jawed when they heard what he had said. If they didn't really like Bremer personally, they loved what he did with Iraq. One of his first or second acts, after he'd canceled a meeting with all of the Iraqi opposition figures, because he says in his memoir, I wanted to show them that I was in charge. He then abolished the Iraqi army and security services, which most people point to as one of the key errors in the post-invasion strategy. But for the Kurds, it was a godsend. He'd just removed the security services that had tortured them and made their families disappear for years. And he'd also removed the only single threat to their autonomous zone in the north. When the Iraqi army went home and was never called back up, there was no longer a military force inside Iraq that could rival them. They had about 60,000 of these irregulars, and that made them the second largest military force inside Iraq, smaller than the Americans, but larger than the British contingent. And there was really nothing at that point that could threaten them in their home. So as much as they didn't like Bremer's style, the prime minister of the Kurdistan region in the north now, Nechervan Barzani, is fond of saying, everyone hates poor Paul Bremer, but I like him. If he hadn't been here, Iraq wouldn't be where it is today. It would be so much better. And that sort of outlines the Kurdish dilemma. And I'll stop and take your questions in a second. Here's President Talabani, the longtime Kurdish rebel, and his son Kubad, with another familiar face in the White House. The Kurds really don't see that they have any friend but America at the moment. Within Iraq, they see that everyone else has an outside sponsor. The Shiite Arabs in the south, even though they're fighting among different parties, they all have connections to Iran, and Iran will definitely sponsor whoever comes out on top, or probably choose who comes out on top. The Arabs, the Sunni Arabs, in Mosul and in Baghdad and out in Anbar province, they clearly have the support and will have the future support of Sunni Arabs around the Gulf, all of the Gulf states who are worried about the rise of Iran. The Kurds are in the unfortunately familiar position of counting on America once again. And they're getting a little nervous as they see the presidential campaign come along. They'll say, the Kurdish leadership will say very plainly, we might want Iraq the least, or like Iraq the least, but we need it the most. As long as it exists, we can have our autonomous zone in the north without the neighbors interfering. As long as America is there to make sure that the neighbors don't interfere. And I talked to a Kurdish family who'd come back from a comfortable life living in Sweden, for example, and this fellow, after telling me that, without any irony, that if I have another son, I'm going to name him Bush, he also said the only reason that we're safe right now is because of the U.S. Army. And he said, I'm leaving Kurdistan with the last American. Anyway, with that, let me take your questions and about Iraq or about Kurdistan or about the book, about anything. Lisa?
Could you talk a little bit more about what you're saying at the end there and the impact of a U.S. withdrawal sooner or later on the Kurdish?
Sure. The Kurds are worried that if the U.S. withdraws too quickly, I guess their nightmare scenario is that the Iraqi civil strife or civil war will turn into a full-fledged regional war. And even though that's already going on to some extent, you already have some proxy fighting going on between Iran and the Gulf and America. If the U.S. were to pull out quickly, then it would throw everything up in the air again. Everyone would have to figure out who was strong enough to be sponsored, and it's very likely that the regional powers, Turkey, Iran, and the Gulf states would get involved by proxy or directly in a civil war that some people fear could become a regional war. For the Kurds right now, they can defend themselves against anybody armed with AK-47s and rocket-propelled grenades and machine guns. They don't stand a chance against an army like Turkey's or Iran's that has helicopters and tanks. And they're worried that if things do turn to complete chaos, that either people will be coming in just to put down the progress they've made, or it's also very likely that different parties will try and play the different Kurdish factions against one another, which has always been easy to do in the past. Although they're getting more cohesive, I think it might be easy to do again. Patrick, and then...
Because of that fear that they have of Turkey and Iran, does it limit the contacts that they have, the political contacts that they have with the Kurdish minorities in those two countries?
Yeah, well, that's David asked me to repeat. Yeah, I'll repeat the questions. Because of the concerns that they have with Turkey and Iran, does that limit the connection they have with minorities in Iran or Turkey? Well, the operative question is really about the PKK. Here are some PKK guerrillas, young girls, volunteers from Iran carrying lumber into the mountains. There's a couple more of those. The PKK are the one pan-Kurdish separatist group. They're mostly Turkish, and we've heard a lot about this because Turkey's been crossing the border to stamp out this guerrilla group, who, as you can see, live in these mountains, which are wonderful territory for a guerrilla fighter. Very easy to defend. The fact is that the Kurds have been keeping ties with everyone, and everyone in the region does. It's kind of a tradition to keep your finger in your neighbor's business and perhaps have a separatist militant group that you could stoke up now and again. The Turks have been screaming at the Americans to pressure the Iraqi Kurds to stop helping the PKK. At the moment, they're not helping them, but they're not fighting a war and dying to get them out of the mountains. Everyone in the region is sort of keeping their options open, and the Kurds in the north of Iraq are keeping open channels to Iran. They're trying to open up channels to Turkey for that day when America might not be there anymore. what's most interesting about that is that the PKK guerrillas have been subdividing so that they are now divided up into an Iranian faction and an Iraqi and a Turkish and a Syrian faction within the PKK. The Iranian faction is the only one that does independent armed action besides the PKK. And as far as I can tell, the only reason they made this division was to give Americans plausible denial if they want to fund covert ops in Iran. And curiously, I mean, there's no evidence of American contact with the Iranian PKK, we could call them. They're called Pajak. There's no evidence of it, but the U.S. State Department has not classified Pajak, the Iranian PKK, as a terrorist group, even after years of saying the PKK is terrorist by any of their names. So, I mean, that's the only evidence that there's a connection there, but it's interesting. Mariana?
Could you say something more about the problem with an independent Kurdish state? I mean, we're so used to now, after breakups of the USSR, for example, and other breakups around the world, we're so used to seeing the emergence of independent states. What is it in this part of the world that's so threatening about that idea? It seems unstaffed relative stability. What's the political issue?
Well, national liberation is a zero-sum game. And the land that they would like, I mean, at the moment, the Kurds have this land here. They don't have some of this. They don't have the city of Kirkuk, which is oil-rich, and they would love to have it. But they've got this land out of Iraq. Under the Iraqi constitution, they have right to form a federal region up there and have their own local laws, which means that Kurds wouldn't have to be wrestling with the same sort of family law as Shiites in the south, who many of them would forbid the sale of alcohol and have women covered head to toe. The Kurds don't want to do that, and under the Iraqi constitution you can have these two different systems. So it's stable now, and in fact many people say with separatists, if you just give them what they want, give them their autonomy, Scotland has its own parliament, Quebec has its own legal system, but Turkey was built in sort of the fear of the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire and defining themselves as Turks and nothing else, not Armenians, not Kurds, is integral to their national identity, and they say their security. As you can see, this is the area that's been inhabited by Kurds for millennium. It takes a little bit of Syria, a small part of Iran, a huge part of Turkey. Who knows, there could be 12 million Kurds in Turkey. There's been this separatist war going on for 20 years with the PKK. The Turks think their nightmare scenario is that the Kurds will get Kirkuk and the oil therein. They'll soon have enough money to have an air force, and they'll start biting off chunks of Turkey. So that, and people in the Middle East, they see very far ahead in these things. They're thinking about what's going to happen 10 years from now. And they want to prevent this from ever happening. And some of the most of the Kurds in northern Iraq think that the cross-border incursions that Turkey's been carrying out over the winter have had nothing to do with the PKK and everything to do with telling the Kurds that, look, we can cross the border, and look, America isn't going to stop us. So that's the... And Iran wouldn't approve of it, Syria wouldn't approve of it, the rest of Iraq wouldn't approve of it. The Kurds know they can't get away with it right now, but they'll all tell you that they dream of it in the future. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question about the likelihood of the U.S. coming to Iran investment in users and what effect it would have with Kurds and
I don't think anyone... the idea of a ground incursion into Iran, I think, is off the table. The U.S. doesn't have the troops. They're overtaxed having the troops they do in Iraq right now. What they mostly talk about is airstrikes. But for effective airstrikes by the U.S. or by Israel, you need human intelligence. And some of the Kurdish dissident groups along that border have been supplying that probably to U.S. offers. They've also been using another Iranian dissident group, which has a very nasty reputation and is also classified as a terrorist group by the United States. They're called the Mujahideen-i Khalq. They've been living under Saddam's protection for a decade in Iraq, and when the war came, they made a quick truce with the Americans, and now they're now cantoned in central Iraq, but they run their own affairs and they have their own weapons. They've been giving information to the Americans on the Iranian nuclear program. Some of it, I don't know how accurate it is. So the chance of a ground incursion through there or through anywhere from Iraq, I would say, is extremely unlikely. But there's definitely some cultivation of these ties, these groups. And strangely, because the U.S. might be interested in using the PKK groups, that's bringing Turkey and Iran together in a common cause, which a lot of people are worried about is dangerous to U.S. interests. Mm-hmm.
Are Kurds predominantly Sunni, or do they not break down along Sunni-Shiite lines?
They're at least 80%, probably higher, Sunni Muslim.
So they follow Turkey and so that's an interesting thing, since Iraq and Iran are predominantly Shiite.
Right. It's interesting. Kurds don't really self-identify by religion, as a rule. As a matter of fact, the only famous Kurd in history, who nobody knows is a Kurd, was Saladin, who was the great Muslim warrior. And Kurds have kind of a mixed feeling about him, because maybe if he had used his incredible powers to fight for a Kurdish homeland instead of fighting for Islam, they figure they could probably be a great empire like Persia, or something everyone would know about. But they're moderate as a rule. There's a proverb in the region that Kurds are only Muslim when compared to infidels. And you can get a nice cold beer in Kurdistan, most of it.
I was going to ask if you could talk about culturally. It looked like your shot of the women. They weren't veiled.
No, yeah. There's actually female soldiers in northern Iraq, in one part of it, and they are. It's not a big fuss if you, for example, when I've done interviews with refugees, to be interviewing a woman without her husband present, something that in Afghanistan you want to be really careful about, or even in Shiite or Sunni Iraq. So it's a much more comfortable place that way. There is an Islamist current up there, and I think it's part of a worldwide trend. But culturally it's much. There are also some Shiite Kurds, but they're a very small minority, and they were horribly oppressed by Saddam, and many of them killed. David?
You talk a lot about the political and military factions, but say more about the culture. I mean, is it flourishing? You say it's safe, but in what ways is it flourishing as you encountered it?
Yeah, well, just.
And can you repeat the question?
I'm sorry, right? Because it's taping. In what ways is the Kurdish culture flourishing aside from all this military political mumbo jumbo? Just being able for the Kurds to be able to educate people in their own language is big. They've had that since 1991, but now they're setting up an American-style university. There are 7 universities in the north. They're hoping that with this building boom and prosperity, they'll improve in their quality, and it's spreading as well. I've got a chapter in the book called "Something That Does Not Love a Wall," and the idea that this can be contained in just Iraqi Kurdistan. Well, I've certainly seen. I've been to some of these universities, and you can meet. And it's again, I have a piece that I put on the show a couple of years ago. You'll meet Kurds from Iran who've come over to get an education, and if you ask them why, they say, "Well, I want to learn an ideology so I can go home and overthrow my government." So it's got definitely a high chance of exporting. Oh, I went political mumbo jumbo again, didn't I? Oh God, what a bad habit. Well, culturally, it's very different from Arab Iraq. For example, New Year, Nowruz, at the spring equinox is celebrated by Persians. It's an ancient Zoroastrian holiday, predates Islam, and the Kurds celebrate that. That's their national holiday. And all across Kurdistan, you can see them building fires. You jump 7 fires as a tradition that time of year, and you go on picnics. And the Kurds have been enjoying that for several years, much more now with their prosperity. I mean, I could go on about the delicious Kurdish food, and actually living now in Jerusalem, I've been able to eat really good Kurdish food there with all of the Jews who escaped Iraq to go to Israel. They make these amazing dumplings called kube. It's like Middle Eastern food, but it's a lot more kind of stick to your ribs for the cold mountain weather. And they've secured the rights to speak their language and celebrate their holidays and be sort of a bilingual part of Iraq, much like Quebec, I would say. Whether they'll be able to keep this as the constitution evolves is an open question. Yeah.
I had a different tone of question, since I know nothing about journalism, which is when you're going to this kind of situation, how do you begin to build the relationships that are going to help you figure out what's going on and how you should weight different testimony that you come across when you're in the field?
Well, it's a great question. I mean,
you can answer in 1 minute or less.
Okay. Yes. Carefully. You do it carefully. No, you rely a lot on fixers, translators, and before I worked in Iraq or Afghanistan, I was based out of Colombia, Bogota, and down there at least I spoke the language, so I could set up everything for myself and sort of way. But when you don't speak fluent Kurdish or Dari or Arabic, you end up relying on translators a lot, and that's, you really have to find someone. I decided after a couple of years of doing this that judgment is more important than language skill. You can get a guy who translates perfectly word for word, but it just doesn't have very good judgment, and that can get you killed. It can also mean, sitting in an interview with an Afghan fixer who was, I'm sure, a very nice person, but he drove me out of my mind. I'd say to him, okay, don't translate this, but can you try to ask how we can get out to see the opium fields? Maybe ask him I swear he turned the guy, and I couldn't understand, but I know what he said was, he said I shouldn't translate this, but blah, 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 blah. So what I found is that once you find someone with good judgment, grab them and be very good to them. And Ayub Nouri, who was my translator for years and who we've had on the show a bunch of times, he's now at the War Radio Project down at Swarthmore in Pennsylvania. And he was a really smart guy, great linguist, but also just really good judgment. And really then it's trial and error. Suddenly you found out some of it's very practical, sort of producer-like stuff. This guy said he could get me an interview with the PKK, and we've been, sitting in this hut in the mountainside for 2 days, and we're nowhere. Why did NPR's fixer get an interview with the PKK? That sort of thing. So you find out, unfortunately, through trial and error, whether you can trust these people, and a lot of it ends up being gut feeling. And then I've been going to Iraq now for 8 years, and you build up this bank of knowledge. It's great, actually, because all the people who are now in the Iraqi government used to be willing to meet you anywhere to talk about their faction and their plan to get rid of Saddam. And so now you see them, and it's good to have all that background. That's a great thing we have with our BBC connection as well, as people like Jim Muir, who was in one of the photos, who's been covering Iraq since I was in diapers. And he therefore knows when you meet this guy and he's the Iraqi ambassador to the United Nations, he'll say, well, this guy used to be a Shiite militiaman, and we can take his remarks in that context. And I mean, I'd say most of the television news out there has, I'm hard pressed to think of someone who has that sort of background with Iraq and can do that. So,
where do you find the fixer in the first place?
Word of mouth. But sometimes you'll end up hiring someone just who speaks good English, and it's fairly trainable work. We ask where I find a fixer, and very often you just you pass someone along, or someone passes someone along to you, or the fixer you used to work with is busy, but he has a friend. Sometimes you have really entrenched fixers. I was thinking actually of a trip I made to Bolivia a couple of years ago, and the government of Evo Morales had just come in and turned the whole system on its head. So the the fixers, the professional fixers who for a dozen years had gotten, ABC News and CBS News, and whoever came to town, you'd call them up and they'd fill your agenda with the meetings of all the important people. These people, along with the entire government, were out on their ear. And the sort of the young, scrappy American who'd gone down there to do a 9-week photo essay on the coca farmers and their rebellion, well, suddenly, she was able to call the president on his cell phone, because that coca farmer was now the president of Bolivia. And so, yeah, sometimes things get turned around, and you have to realize, well, I'm sorry, your connections aren't any good anymore. Lisa?
Just for those who don't know Quil, he's very self-effacing, so he won't say this for himself, but Ayub Nouri, the fixer that he mentioned, who helped us out a lot and obviously helped him out a lot. He could go places where Quil couldn't necessarily go and introduce him to the right people. Ayub wrote a story in the New York Times Sunday magazine not too long ago about his own experience, and he worked, I think, with, was it ABC and NPR?
Yeah, New York Times as well, before he worked with me. Yeah.
But it was Quil who had been working with him, and one day Quil, knowing that he was going to have to leave Iraq, gave him the tape recorder and said, okay, now you do it. You want to come be a reporter. And credited Quil with being the one to basically help him pave the way out of Iraq, which is where he is right now. But I had a question just about...
I was hoping you had a question.
You can't, you mentioned Bolivia. Can you talk about when it's beneficial for you to have a beard and look like you're Latin American or South American or Kurdish or Iraqi?
Yeah, I have questions about disguise and facial hair. When I first moved to Colombia in 1996, all I could really manage was this pathetic goatee mustache combo, which I decided was all that much more effective because only a Latin would have kept that on his face. So that worked very well. And then I grew sort of a full beard. I have never gone all the way to what they call the July 14th mustache in Iraq. Let me show you a good example of that. This is Khosrat Rasul. He dies that. Anyway. He's as old as Jalal, so you figured out. In Afghanistan, I can get really hairy, and I'll indulge here. And if I don't shave for about 3 or 4 weeks, I can end up looking like a Tajik, which is great. And throw a blue blazer over a shalwar kameez, and people start asking you for directions. But in Iraq, what I really should have done is just shaved everything off. And my strategy is actually, you go to a local barber as soon as you get there, and you don't give them any instruction, and then suddenly your head looks like every other head on that block. Ivan Watson had to dye his hair because he's blonde, but I don't have that problem. So. But yeah, they'll in Iraq they'll shave you down to just stubble and leave your mustache, and then and that it's not on a serious note. I think some of us early on thought we were cocky and we thought that we could pass and that stuff, but they'll make you buy your shoes. People know where a jacket comes from unless you go shopping in the neighborhood, buy yourself a suit. And I know some people who did that. They bought an ill-fitting Iranian-made suit that they bought in Baghdad and that sort of thing, especially as Iraq became more and more dangerous. What some of these tricks do, like growing facial hair, some people who have lighter hair, they'll put a keffiyeh on. And it feels kind of hokey, but what it does help with is the first glance. If people are looking in the car to see something out of place, they might look at me and say, okay. And if they look closer, they're going to realize that my shoes aren't from there and that my jacket isn't from there. So it's really not something to rely on at all. But when you do have to move, it's a way of shaving off, some of the odds of unwanted attention. Here's the book. Thanks.
Quil's book is available online. Look for Invisible Nation and in bookstores near us.
Thank you.